that it'll work, or you may just simply trust something because it has a certain brand name, right? Hondas or Toyotas never break down. This was something I was told when I came here, and then I must have bought the one Honda that always broke down. But that's okay. That's how you learn how to fix a car, right? You buy a lemon. But the point here is there are thousands of ways of trying to break that informational asymmetry, especially with these little awesome gadgets here, right? On your phone, you can look up whether a specific car you're trying to buy on a used car lot has been in any accidents, for example. You look at the VIN number, the little number on the dash, and for that car, not just for that type of car, you can look at the history of accidents for that particular car. So these screening type mechanisms are really becoming more and more popular, not just for cars, but for all types of goods. And that's obviously a good thing for consumers, not a good thing for sellers of low quality goods. All right? That's all I'm going to say about informational asymmetries. There's much, much more there. I think that's a really exciting area of research and an exciting area of looking at problems, and we only always get a lecture for each of these. The textbooks, both the Rubenfeld and the Perloff books, talk about these models extensively, and I'm happy to point you in further directions. But now, did I mention it's Earth Day yet? Sure, Earth Day. Let's talk about externalities. You may have spoken about externalities before in other classes. When you take an environmental economics class, you speak about externalities for about half the environmental economics class, but it really is, to me, one of the most important market failures that we can think of. I'll give you lots and lots of examples, but let's first off think about what an externality actually is, and then put it in plain English, and then we're going to put it in our demand and supply model and see what comes out here. All right? So an externality, the formal definition is a cost or a benefit arising from an activity which does not accrue to the person or organization carrying out the activity. What? All right. If you live in a dorm, I used to live in a dorm. I have a 16-year-old nephew who came to visit us and who tried to play me music to see how young I really was, and I liked really loud music back in the day, but he played this thing for me called Skrillex, where I started shaking my speaker, and I was like, hold on, this can't be right. There's something wrong with this thing. It sounded really broken to me. This is how I figured out that I'm actually old and pathetic. But so I know I'm not pathetic. I know I'm old though. But the point here is, let's say you live in a dorm. It's 2 o'clock at night. Your neighbor's had 6 wine coolers, and is feeling really good. So your neighbor figures out that he's finally going to pick up that econ textbook, and he's going to study. And he's going to study better than anybody's ever studied before in the history of Berkeley. In order to help him study, he's going to turn on Skrillex. Really useful. So you're lying next door, and you're doing what you should be doing the day before the midterm or the final for economics. You're doing nothing, right? You went for a nice walk. You got a massage. You ate well. You drank lots of water. You reviewed your notes one more time for about an hour to make sure you get it all. And then you got an early night, right? That's exactly what you should be doing. So your brain is functioning the next morning. How do you feel about your neighbor right then? Not so good, right? So neighbor might get a huge private benefit from Skrillex consumption, but there is a cost that he or she imposes upon you that he's not accountable for yet, right? So the point here is that noise is keeping you awake, and you will do worse on your exam the next day because your idiot neighbor woke you up at 2:30 in the morning, right? He does not pay or accrue the full cost of his activities because nobody's making him pay for that, right? So the notion here is he will turn up his volume inefficiently loudly. I don't know whether that's an adjective or an adverb. I'll figure that out after lecture. But he'll blast his music at a level that's simply not efficient and impose a cost on you that's not right. All right? So the thing here about externalities that took me a long time to get, so I will say it right up front so you don't have to wander through the darkness for years, is there's a physical relationship that determines whether something's an externality or not in most settings, right? There's something about your activity that affects others positively or negatively, right? This could be on the consumption side, on the consumer side, but this could also be on the producer side. The simple notion here is you do something that has an impact on somebody else that you are not directly paying for, right, or getting the benefit of. And I'll give you lots and lots of examples of how this is the case. How this could be the case. All right. So the notion here is there are not just negative externalities. When you open the newspaper today, Krugman's back on climate change today, but the notion is externalities can be positive or they can be negative. So they can help or harm others. Either way, it'll lead to an inefficient outcome. So if there's an externality, meaning you're doing something that harms somebody else or makes somebody else worse off, that's a negative externality. If you're doing something that you don't get the full benefit of, but maybe your neighbor gets the benefit of your activities, that's a positive externality. Now, again, as in most models that we talk about in this class, is it depends on who you are. Right? What if you happen to sleep just much better with Skrillex playing at 140,000 decibels in your ears? Right? Then maybe your neighbor's music consumption causes you to sleep better, and it's actually a positive externality. Who knows? Maybe some people sleep better to Skrillex. For most of us, right, we think deforestation is a bad thing, right? Forests protect watersheds. They sequester carbon. They're just so pretty. They smell good. They provide habitat for all kinds of animals that we like and don't like. So if your activity results in deforestation that you don't, or trees dying that you don't pay for, that's usually a negative externality. But for somebody, there may be positive effects of environmental destruction. If you have really terrible allergies against tree pollens, you want to see all forests being cut down, right? So that's Perloff humor. Hey, my allergies are gone. I like that one. So I once had a Canadian GSI. Not doing it again. You know why? This is not anti-Canadian. There's nothing to do with Canada. This has all to do with Celine Dion. So she loved Celine Dion. And not just like, yeah, she's Canadian, so I guess there's some solidarity here. No, there was an actual passion for Celine Dion singing, which to me is very similar to when my cats try and fight off the raccoons in the backyard. It's a similar level of enjoyment I get. I do not like Celine Dion. She loved Celine Dion. She had the office right across from me, and when she got really happy, she would play Celine Dion. So she would grade faster, which was great, but I was miserable. My productivity, I wish I had a time series. You can see the Canadian GSI effect right there. So negative externality to me. But if, and now I'm making this up, right? First part's kind of made up too, but the second part is definitely made up. What if there were another GSI in her office that also liked Celine Dion? So by her blasting Celine Dion, the other GSI likes Celine Dion, so that same music playing at the same time in the same environment causes a positive externality for the other person sitting next door that likes Celine Dion and makes me age rapidly across the hall, right? So the same thing can be a positive to some and a negative to others. So it really depends on what your preferences are again. Now, I don't really like sports, all right, except for soccer. Tomorrow's a big day. So this guy right here is arguably, and I remember him when I was little because he's got the number that's my birthday. Greatest basketball player of all time, maybe, right? Not clear. Michael Jordan, you may remember him. He also had a baseball career which wasn't quite as visible. But Michael Jordan was an amazing player. I mean, if you've never seen Michael Jordan play, which is unlikely, but if you're a foreign student and you don't know who it is, go to YouTube and look at Best of Michael Jordan. There's these 5-minute things where you just see plays where you're like, I don't know how this is humanly possible. It's amazing. So Michael Jordan, very famous basketball player. I've tried to do that move. I can't do it. So Michael Jordan actually had lots and lots of positive externalities for other teams, right? Let's say you're in a town that has a really crappy basketball team, right? Like that Will Ferrell movie where he's dressed up in a sun suit. Nobody goes to see your crappy basketball team. But what happens when Michael Jordan comes to town? Sells out, right? Every kid in the neighborhood, Michael Jordan's in town. I didn't even know we had a basketball team, but we'll go, right? So the notion here is that during regular season away games in the 91-92 season, that's when I graduated from high school, ticket revenues went up by 2.5 million during away games when the Chicago Bulls were in town versus not. And local TV advertising revenue in markets, right, that showed the local basketball games when the Bulls were in town also shot up. So there was a positive externality of Jordan coming to town, which is these extra revenues that went to the home team in the form of higher ticket sales for these games when the Bulls were in town compared to the average team that came to town, and increase in local advertising revenues. Trying to figure out these numbers is tricky because you've got to make sure you subtract all kinds of other confounders, but these are pretty good estimates. So did Jordan just have a positive effect or positive externality on these other crappy basketball teams? No. So if you look over time, during the time that Michael Jordan played, or was at his peak, so 91 was a good year, what you saw is that TV advertising was $6.6 million higher when Jordan was playing and $13.9 million higher during playoffs. So the presence of one sort of iconic sports star raises the demand for people who want to watch these games, and in response, the advertisers are willing to spend more money. Plus, you can buy hats, shoes, pants, socks, shoelaces, wristbands, I don't know what else you can buy, cell phone cases with NBA logos on it. So clothing and video sales also were up by $15.1 million. These are shared by all teams. They don't accrue to the Chicago Bulls. So again, it was an external positive externality. So the total value of Michael Jordan's positive externalities is $40.3 million. Not bad for one guy, right? Again, this was 25 years ago almost, so these are 25-year-old dollars. It's a bigger number today. Further, orders of magnitude, this is actually a lot of dollars. I know we hear about billions and trillions and gazillions all the time, but a positive externality of $40.3 million compared to even what Jordan was getting paid at the time, that's a significant improvement. The other thing, and you don't just see this with Jordan, you see this in other sports too. If you think about motorsports racing, Michael Schumacher, maybe the most successful racer of all time, people would just come to places to go see him race, right? So there's this positive externality of having one of these rock stars perform. All right. Now, Max, it's Earth Day, you said. I don't want to talk about basketball on Earth Day. I want to talk about what I think about when I think about externalities, which is usually environmental externalities. So if we have externalities, why are we worse off? All right. So what I want to think of here is the example of a power plant. Fiona is going to start working on power plants very soon. Max has worked on power plants for a while. In fact, when we at the UC Energy Institute go on field trips, where do we go? Power plants. Where else would you go, right? So we visited a coal-fired power plant, natural gas one, a nuclear one. We visited solar installations. It's cool. I've got hard hats from all of these power plants. So it's a bunch of econ nerds climbing up these power plants. I can send you. I should have brought a picture. I'll show it to you next time. It's awesome. So think about a couple of simplifying assumptions, and making this more complicated is pretty easy, but it makes things more complicated. So we're going to keep it really, really simple for now. So think of a market for power, and by power I mean electricity, that's competitive. Okay? So individual power plants sell into a perfectly competitive market for power. Individual firms or generators produce electricity and air pollution. Right? This is reasonable. Everybody except for the solar and the wind and the hydro guys produces air pollution. Coal, natural gas, oil all produce SOx, NOx, particulates, whatever you can think of. I'm going to assume here, which is also a heroic assumption, that each megawatt of power produces 1 unit of air pollution. All right? So the more power you produce, the more air pollution you produce. It's a nice linear and constant relationship where in real life this may not necessarily be true. And I'm also going to argue that the only way to decrease pollution is to decrease paper. No. Boo. Power. Production. You'd see a lot of paper mills right next to power plants. Paper mills are always next to rivers because you need a lot of water to put out. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so the only way to decrease pollution is to decrease power production. Of course, in the real world, when you're talking about local pollutants like PM10, NOx, SOx, and so on, you can scrub that stuff out of the fumes that come out of a power plant and turn it into drywall. When it comes to CO2, the main greenhouse gas, you can't scrub that out of the gases that come out of the power plant. So what I want to think about here now is that power plant has two types of costs, right? When we're talking about costs of production, we so far have always said, each individual firm as its cost. And when we talk about cost, we talk about average total, average variable, and marginal cost. Those reflect the full opportunity cost of using those inputs, right? Full opportunity cost of labor and capital and materials and so on. So now we're going to break this apart a little bit and break our costs into private costs and social costs. Now the private costs that firms have or accrue during production are the cost of producing whatever output they're producing, right? So you're paying for labor, you're paying for your capital. If you're a coal-fired power plant, you're paying for coal, you're paying for water, you're paying for land, you're paying for all kinds of things. But these are all the things where you write a check and you pay the full opportunity cost of those inputs to production. What does the power plant not pay for currently, unless you're in California or parts of the East Coast? Yeah, the use of the atmosphere, essentially, right? So they get to pump as much stuff into the atmosphere as they want, and they don't really have to pay for it, unless we regulate, and we'll talk about that in great detail. Now, is that a problem? Right, is pollution bad? Anybody here been to Beijing lately? Yeah, how was it? Cool city, but pollution? Terrible, right? I mean, they have these things called blue sky days, and they count them, which is when you can actually see the sky, right? And they're not very frequent. So pollution's bad. What does pollution do? Does it just look and smell bad? Creates lots of health problems, right? Especially for small children whose Lungs are still not fully developed, so it leads to long-run problems for small children in terms of asthma. It leads to heart problems, lung problems, all kinds of health problems that lead to mortality, and excess morbidity. Right? So there are costs that the production of power impose on society in the forms of negative health consequences. So I grew up in northern Bavaria. There was this thing called Waldsterben in the 1980s, which was lots of the power was produced using high sulfur coal in Eastern Europe. That stuff would sort of blow across the border, turn into acid rain because there's sulfur dioxide in the exhaust that turns into sulfuric acid. In the rain, it drops onto the soil, increases the pH, makes your soils more acidic, and trees don't like that, so all the trees died. Right? And of course, there's a value to forests. So the notion here is these private production activities have certain external costs, and the producers of the power and the pollution don't necessarily have to pay for their external costs. So that creates a wedge or a difference between the private costs of production and the social costs of production. Right? The firm pays for the use of all of its inputs in good economic fashion. It pays for the full economic costs, not just accounting costs, but it gets the free use of the environment for now if it's unregulated. So social costs are the private costs of production plus the costs from these externalities. Now, why is this an issue? All right. So let's think about that for a second. Quantity, price. I know how to do this. I just need to make sure I explain it clearly. All right. If I don't know how to do this, I should quit my job right now. Here we go. So supply Actually, let's do this differently. There's 4 different ways of doing it. And every time I walk to class, I'm thinking of which way is the best way to do it. Let's do it for the firm. Here we go. Okay, this is the private marginal cost of production to the firm. Okay, we have a competitive market for power. So this is P star. So the firm produces Q star. Right. So this is the price that comes out of the market. Firm produces this Q star level of output, and that's what we've studied so far. Now, what I'm going to argue is that the social cost of producing whatever output that this firm is producing is higher than the private cost of production, right? So this marginal cost accounts for the cost of labor and capital and all this other good stuff, but it doesn't account for the cost of pollution. Now, there are 2 ways of drawing this. I'm going to draw the easy way first. The easy way to draw this is just to say for each unit produced, there's an external cost. This is the cost of additional child morbidity, mortality, trees dying, everything rolled into one. And I'm going to say increasing output by 1 unit adds the same dollar damage to society. The other way of thinking about this, and this relates to the underlying physical relationship here, is this external marginal cost may actually be increasing in output, right? That the first couple of units of pollution don't do a lot of damage, but if you add more and more and more, the size of the exposed population gets bigger, and damage is actually increasing quantity. So this is constant, and then maybe in a little practice question, I'll show you what this looks like with increasing marginal external costs. So what's social costs, right? Social marginal cost here is the marginal external cost plus the marginal private cost. So for each unit of output, you just add 2 squares of external costs to your private marginal costs. Shift up the marginal private cost. And that is your social marginal cost, right? So you add the marginal external cost, health damages from pollution, to the private cost, and the sum of those 2 tell you the total social marginal cost of production, counting the use of all resources in production. Now, what's the efficient level of output now if that's the market price? Is it higher? Is it lower than before? It's lower. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got the equilibrium level of production for the individual firm if it's left alone. That's Q star. But the efficient level of production is actually Q double star, where the social marginal cost is equal to market price, right? So what's the takeaway message here? There's a couple, right? The first takeaway message here is going to be the following. Let's do it this way. So marginal social cost is usually higher than marginal private cost. If there are no externalities, then marginal social cost and marginal private costs are exactly the same. Second takeaway message is the equilibrium level of output by an individual firm here is going to be Q star if the individual firm just does what's privately optimal. What we want the firm to do is take the marginal social cost and use that as its output deciding criterion. Wow, I'm losing it a little bit today. This is the one we want them to use. This is the one they're going to use unless we force them. That results in a lower level of output than what the firm would do left alone. So generally speaking, do we have a problem that we're producing excess amounts of pollution? Well, that depends, right? But in most settings, I would argue, for example, in Beijing, China, or in Shanghai, or if you go to Mumbai or Delhi,